than would be the case to be expected if nuclear power is so critical and so reliable. Looking back since 2010 and a year-on-year average, each nuclear station is down for nearly 25% of a typical year. If we look at Hartlepool, each reactor is down for 90 days a year on average. Dungeness was nearly 200 days a year on average until its early closure. And even Sizewell B, the youngest power station in the existing fleet and the greatest remaining lifespan, has been non-operational on an average of 64 days a year since 2010. So it's truly astonishing, that to me, and again it destroys the argument about why new nuclear is required. Now, as one of the witnesses at committee stage stated, each nuclear station actually requires further nuclear as a backup because of all these outages. Now, what Amendment 7 does then is it provides Parliament and bill payers at least some clarity on how the new station is performing in terms of its ability to be generating electricity at times of need. Now, Amendment 7 also provides for annual reporting and assessment of the condition and operability of the station, because if we look at the existing fleet of nuclear reactors, we've seen how the anticipated lifespan and operation of the plant can change quickly, with Dungeness closing 7 years early. Now, considering how it was actually effectively offline for the preceding 2 years, then had Dungeness been subject to report requirements for what I'm asking for here, then at least Parliament would have understood the situation at Dungeness, and it probably would elicited more questions from parliamentarians in terms of state of that power station. And if we're looking at a 6-year operational contract, when, bear in mind, no nuclear power station in the UK has went to a 50-year milestone yet, then it's important as that nuclear power station plan ages that parliamentarians and bill payers understand the performance of the station and critically its operational lifespan and any liabilities and repairs that are required, which is what Amendment 7 seeks to do. Now, Amendment 8 is linked to the operation of the plant, and this allows for penalties if the plant is down too long. It seems logical, if we take the government argument that nuclear power is so critical, then they need to minimise the risk of extended outages. So Amendment 8 does this by at least having the ability for the government to impose penalties and seek financial recovery if the station is down for too long. And I've inserted a suggested timeline of 60 days, which I think is a reasonable point for penalties to kick in, especially when we look at the recent historical performance of the existing fleet. And that actually, in looking forward, that still allows that station to be down for 15% of the time a typical year before penalties would be incurred. Now, Amendment 10 is also about transparency, this time in the event the nuclear company becomes insolvent. It's only right that the taxpayer understands the liabilities that the government are willing to pick up in the event of insolvency, and being compelled to report the cost of getting a plant operational again, what its remaining lifespan is, and any other liabilities that might not be covered anymore due to insolvency, such as decommissioning, might at least focus minds on the merits of continuing to operate the plant or not. Otherwise, we remain in the position the Secretary of State could be writing blank cheques that Parliament is unaware of. Yep.
Very grateful. He's raising some important questions about cost and reliability. What is his recommendation as to what the government should do to make the position better?
Well, my ideal recommendation would be not to invest in a new nuclear plant. That would be the first thing. But if we take it as it is and we're looking at this going forward, for me, the government needs to, first of all, satisfy ourselves with the design, which, bear in mind, the EPR system's still not working anywhere in the world. But that's the whole point of this amendment, is about at least having yearly assessments and reports to Parliament that would actually advise on that reliability. And as I say, that would allow other parliamentarians to understand that, challenge the government if need be, and help put pressure on that nuclear consortia if it wasn't performing to plan. And that for me is critical. It's actually getting what's actually signed up for going forward.
Will you give way?
Yeah, I'll give way. Yeah.
I thank him for giving way. Does he agree with me that actually increasingly the view that we need a permanent baseload for energy supply is outdated thinking, and that most modern thinking around the idea of energy supply all day, every day, is that we don't need this idea of baseloads anymore?
Yeah, actually I agree wholeheartedly with that. And actually, as far back as 2015, Steve Halliday, the then Chief Executive of National Grid, actually said baseload was an outdated concept, and a false argument. So I agree with that. And again, it goes back to my point that nuclear is actually too inflexible because it's either on or off. Yes. And it's actually nuclear that leads to wind turbines being turned off so often as well. So that's a bizarre thing. Nuclear's got a hidden cost because of the energy constraint payments that are made. If I return to the amendments, Mr Deputy Speaker, our Amendment 10 is actually made to cost 32, as is Labour's Amendment 5. However, I would just point out, as I stated at committee stage, I don't support the Labour amendment because I believe actually compelling the government to take over a plan which is confirmed to have been economically unviable then is throwing good money after bad, which is actually the polar opposite of the rationale behind our Amendment 10. But to be clear, I certainly support all the other Labour amendments, particularly the ones about foreign ownership. I'll be happy to support them if it goes to vote. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, people will be glad to know, if I just turn to new Clause 1, this too is another attempt at transparency at what could otherwise be the Secretary of State committing huge sums of money via the specialist administration route. I do not think it too onerous, again, for the Secretary of State to have to report to Parliament on the likely costs of what is the bailout of an insolvent company. Now, at committee stage, the Minister argued that this would hamper the process, but given the SAR process has only actually just been implemented for the first time at the moment through a bill going bust, it's unclear to me why a report to Parliament is going to unduly delay what could be a complicated process going through the courts anyway. And the Minister also stated that the court process would provide enough transparency, but also that the reporting requirement might have commercial implications and affect the Secretary of State's ability to bring the administration to an end. Now, both aspects of these cannot be true. There's either enough transparency or there isn't. And it seems to me somehow reporting to Parliament shouldn't hinder that transparency process and shouldn't have commercial implications. So that's why this clause has been put forward, to ensure clear report of information to Parliament. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I made it clear from the outset that this bill lacks transparency. Clauses 2 and 3 give way too much power to the Secretary of State to assess what he or she believes to be a value for money nuclear project and then commit bill payers to paying for it. And so while I'm opposed to the bill, I haven't even proposed wrecking amendments, because these amendments today are all designed to ensure, firstly, parliamentarians and secondly, bill payers know exactly what money has been committed to and for what reasons. And if the government has faith in its arguments that nuclear energy is required and that it represents true value for money, then it would seem to me the government should willingly accept these amendments and new Clause 1. Otherwise, if the amendments get defeated in votes, then we know it's all about continued backroom deals. The fear won't stand up to scrutiny if they're actually to report upon the actual sums themselves.
Report on proposed payments to a nuclear administrator or relevant licensee nuclear company.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read a second time. Sir John Redwood.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome proposals that will create more generating capacity in the United Kingdom. As the Minister knows, I am extremely worried that we are already typically 10% dependent on imported electricity, and that the current plans envisage us becoming more import dependent, with a preferred route for electricity provision being the construction of more interconnectors. And I'm worried about this both on security grounds, because we link ourselves at our peril into an energy short system on the continent of Europe, which is far too dependent on Mr. Putin and Russian gas. And I worry about it because we are short of electricity and gas at the moment, and we see the price pressures that creates, and I think we should be doing more to expand the supply, both electricity and domestic gas. And I think the SNP have made some important points, although they come at nuclear power from a different perspective to that of the government, that whilst we could usefully enjoy more nuclear power, it is very important those projects are timely and cost controlled and are technologies which will deliver reliable power on a sustainable basis. So I have this question really for the Minister. Does he agree with me that nothing in this legislation and nothing that he can now do can prevent the proportion of our electricity generated by nuclear declining for the whole of this decade. Because as I understand it, these projects take so long to get type approval and financing and then in construction. And as I also understand it, all but one of our current nuclear power stations is scheduled to close by 2030. And although we have one large nuclear power station that should come on stream during that time period, it will not offset all of the capacity which is taken out. So it would be misleading to suggest that nuclear power can do anything to solve our problem this decade. Now, I don't want to get in the way of it solving the problem for a following decade. We do need to think ahead, and these are very long-term projects. But the context of this debate is that we are energy short for the next decade, and even with best intentions with this legislation and the possible schemes that would come under it, we are not going to do anything to contribute to resolving our energy shortage in the decade that we now face. And I'd also like his thoughts on the pace of rollout of nuclear power, if this bill goes well and is passed through with suitable amendment, what would he expect to see by way of incremental capacity for the following 2 decades after 2030, if all went well with the ideas embedded in this legislation, given the state of technology, the rather imperfect supply of capacity, and above all, perhaps, whether he's got plans for smaller nuclear where it might be possible to more quickly approve a project and then to scale it up and roll it out in more than a few locations.
I thank you for giving way on that point. I mean, the purpose about small modular nuclear reactors is because we're going to be building 10 or 15 of them. We're going to be able to bring the price down, which is one of the points made. But is he also concerned that there are now 18 major projects in oil and gas exploration which seemingly have been put on hold when we need these projects and these fields to come online now?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes, I fear I may be wandering a little from the actual bill, but given the general context of energy shortage and given the crucial role that gas has been playing in recent months in generating electricity, because we are short of nuclear power and we're short of wind power when the wind doesn't blow, I would strongly recommend that we get on with exploiting our own gas reserves, because it's greener and cheaper than relying on gas for halfway around the world in an LNG tanker, or relying ultimately on Mr. Putin's gas routed via the continent. So I think that's probably an argument for another day, but I'm grateful for my honourable friend, and I'm very grateful for the Deputy Speaker to allow me to answer that very good point. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like the Minister to set out a little bit more of the context of when nuclear might start contributing to our electricity demand and need, how he sees the balance of that developing between possible small nuclear rolled out at greater scale and 1 or 2 large nuclear projects which may still be around. And would he also agree with me that given the hugely radical electrical revolution the government wishes to encourage, to switch home heating from predominantly gas to electricity and to switch much transport from predominantly diesel and petrol to electricity, we're going to need a massive expansion of total capacity. And yet we start from a position where we don't have enough capacity for the current levels of our demand, and where the nuclear element in that is actually contracting quite a lot over this decade.
The House.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As a lifelong anti-nuclear power campaigner, I couldn't miss to fail to speak in this debate, and also represent the views of the many Bath constituents who have written to me over the last weeks and months to vote and speak against this bill. We need to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest. Do we need nuclear power to get there? And is nuclear energy a fair deal for our consumers? While nuclear power is not a carbon fuel, it is enormously expensive, costing twice as much as generation from renewables. And in answer to the honourable member who's just spoken, I just believe we just need to roll out renewable energy, because we have got the capacity. We are, as Britain, a country that is surrounded by sea and a lot of wind even further out. There's projects like floating wind out there. I speak a lot to that industry. If only the government had the political will to actually make that renewable energy revolution happen. I'm happy to give way.
But what difference would it have made if we'd had double the amount of wind capacity in some of those weeks recently when it was only supplying 2% of our total electricity because there was no wind?
I thank him for giving way. As I said, compared to what the potential of offshore wind actually is, particularly further out, where the wind is blowing all the time and he only needs to talk to the industry, where we can actually, if the government was prepared to invest much more into offshore wind and not just rely on the small projects that we currently have. Yes, we have doubled our capacity of offshore wind thanks to the Liberal Democrats in government some time ago now, but there's still no level playing field for the renewables energy sector. They come and speak on this again and again and again. If only the government was prepared to actually set a regulatory level playing field, we could see a lot more renewable energy to cover our energy costs. So, let me repeat, Mr. Deputy Speaker, while nuclear power is not a carbon fuel, it is enormously expensive, costing twice as much as generation from renewables, and the cost will in the end fall on the consumer. We have seen the disasters of that in recent years. In recent weeks. Quite apart from the long-term cost of decommissioning, disposal and storage of waste, nuclear is an unusual technology that sees cost rise over time instead of fall. In other words, it has a high need for government subsidy. The government says that this bill is about saving money for consumers by removing barriers to private investment in the nuclear sector. But this is misleading. The government's proposed funding model, regulated asset base, provides no protection for consumers. Instead, the evidence shows that costs for abandoned nuclear power stations were still passed on to consumers under this model. Let's look at what happened in the US, where a version of the regulated asset-based model was introduced over 10 years ago. It was called early cost recovery. As in Britain, ECR was sold to policymakers as a way of lowering the cost of capital, thereby making nuclear power more competitive with other generating sources. But the lower capital cost was not a true saving. At its 2009 peak, the nuclear renaissance consisted of application to build 31 units pending at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. 29 of the 31 have been cancelled, despite expenditure exceeding $20 billion. No new US nuclear plants have gone into service. In South Carolina, ratepayers are now having to pay $2.3 billion for a cancelled nuclear plant, while the US electric customers are exposed to paying more than $10 billion for cancelled nuclear plants and another $13.5 billion in cost overruns. No reactors have come online as a result of the US shift to early cost recovery. Florida and South Carolina have repealed the laws allowing early cost recovery. No states have enacted such laws in the last decade. So why on earth is the Tory government introducing a failed financial model from the US? In contrast, the cost of renewables are falling globally. Renewables are significantly undercutting fossil fuels as the cheapest form of energy as the cost of renewable technologies fall. According to the International Energy Agency, the world's best solar power schemes now offer the cheapest electricity in history. I won't give way again. Renewable energy is the future, and we in the UK are ideally placed to take advantage of the wind and wave power all around us. And when tidal wave projects have been cancelled in the past by the UK, it was always on cost basis. Why don't we look at those projects again, because they're truly renewable and they're truly the future. We could be an exporter of renewables. Onshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity generation in the UK.
Order, I have been incredibly generous, as I was to Sir John. Could the Honourable Lady tell me which clause she is speaking to?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm coming to the end.
Okay. Yes.
As I said, I couldn't miss to speak in this debate because I believe the whole bill is a complete failure. But I will be supporting all the amendments that are proposed today because they are improving the bill, but I will be voting against the bill. Thank you.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in this nuclear energy financing bill debate. As the co-founder of the Nuclear Delivery Group, along with my fellow atomic kitten, the Honourable Member for Copeland, I've been at the forefront of campaigning for nuclear energy to form a key part of our 2050 net zero strategy since becoming the MP for Untitled. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can talk about the various amendments tabled by the opposition, but the reality is this bill is critical if the UK is to tackle climate change. It's critical for the UK's energy security and stability. The demand for electricity will only rise as we phase out carbon-based energy. Whilst renewables like solar, wind and tidal energy must form part of our zero-carbon mix, they simply do not currently offer the capacity or reliability that we will need to go forward. Nuclear power is the only viable alternative to fossil fuels that the UK can implement in the timeframes required to... Of course I won't give way.
I thank her for giving way. So when she speaks to amendments, will she explain why she opposes any of these amendments? Because I'd have thought putting forward amendments about transparency and just highlighting the costs of nuclear would be a good thing.
Several of the amendments you mentioned related to information flow and financing, and I'm going to be talking more about the financing and how that is so important to my constituents on Honest Morn. And in recent years, we've seen our nuclear generation capacity drop and UK progress on the decarbonisation of power stall. Over the past year, I've been working hard to raise the issue of financing for nuclear power with ministers and officials because it is a key blocker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to bringing more nuclear power online. The majority of my constituents support Wilvernowath. It's recognised as the best site in the UK, possibly the world, to host a nuclear power plant. And I'd like to end by saying this bill will make a huge difference to Honest Morn. My constituency has one of the lowest GVAs in the UK, and we desperately need these jobs to come through. And I would like to say that on behalf of the Nuclear Delivery Group, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank all of my constituents, and in particular the community of Llanbadrig, for remaining positive and united in the hope that Honest Morn sees the fruits of this important piece of legislation.
So it would be really useful when people are contributing to this report state that they could mention some of the amendments or the new clause now and again. Charlotte Nichols.
Charlotte, sorry. I'm sorry.
Take my mask off. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I welcome the return of this important bill from committee stage, and I'm pleased to support it, as of course is the Labour Party. Indeed, while our NHS is the Attlee government's greatest achievement, it was his Labour government that approved this country's first nuclear reactors, which have been supplying clean energy ever since. It is regrettable that it has taken the Conservatives over a decade in office before they have brought forward these new plans to finance and ensure the next generation of nuclear that we need. I'm concerned that much of our domestic expertise and supply chain capacity has eroded in that time, but it is still true that if the best time to build a nuclear plant was 10 years ago, the second best time is today. It's especially important with the retirement of Hunterston B last week, which alone provided 1 gigawatt of the UK's 7.9 gigawatt nuclear capacity, enough to power 1.7 million homes. As our energy bills rocket in the months to come as a result of huge volatility in the international gas markets, we will be reminded yet again of the importance of the diversification, sovereignty, security and constancy of our power supplies, something which is addressed in Labour's amendments. Ensuring a further generation of nuclear plants is the best way to address this, as well as being environmentally sustainable as we seek net zero. There are too many myths about nuclear power that undermine it in the public mind and in pockets of this place. Let us hear the facts. Nuclear power has the lowest life cycle carbon of all technologies, the lowest land use of all low carbon technologies, the lowest mining and metal use of all low-carbon technologies, and the highest employment multiplier of all low-carbon technologies. Those peddling these myths rely on misleading comparisons, over-optimism about alternatives, and wholly outdated concerns about safety that don't reflect the reality of modern nuclear plants. We shouldn't be scared from making the positive case for nuclear and making it strongly and proudly. Nuclear is safe, reliable, and directly creates quality, high-paying, unionised jobs, as well as supporting many more in its supply chain. I declare an interest, as Warrington North has the third most nuclear jobs of any constituency in the country, despite not having a nuclear plant. And indeed, just recently I visited Hinkley Point C with the nuclear APPG to see for myself the fruits of the labour of thousands of my Warrington North constituents who work in its supply chain, alongside many other nuclear workers on all aspects, from new build to decommissioning to nuclear medicine and nuclear propulsion for spaceflight. Maltex in Birchwood in my constituency, for example, is currently working on stable salt reactors, which would actually recycle nuclear waste from older fleets of reactors by using this as the fuel for future fleets. These are good jobs in stark contrast to the increasing casualisation of our labour market and the gig economy more widely. High-quality apprenticeships, including at the University Technical College in Warrington, working with employers like Sellafield, open up great opportunities for my constituents in high-skilled roles in a world-class industry. We are proud of them and would welcome many more. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'll thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I just wondered if she had any figures on how many of those jobs in Warrington might be put at risk by the exclusion of companies that are part foreign-owned, as Labour's amendment might keep out of new nuclear build if the amendment was passed?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that question. I don't have the data on my person at this point, but ultimately I think more jobs are at risk in Warrington North in the nuclear sector if we don't approve the building of new nuclear, and that's something that, whether it's direct state investment, whether it's a regulated asset-based model as we're discussing today, or whether it's foreign investment, the fact is that we need to get those built because all of those jobs will be at risk if we don't. And as going back to the point that the Honourable Gentleman raised there, we've heard complaints about the cost of the regulated asset-based model, and indeed my preference would be direct state investment into this vital national infrastructure that keeps the stations and the power they produce in public ownership. But nonetheless, the model that we're discussing today must be recognised as an investment that guarantees construction and production over the longer term. As I wind up my remarks today, I want to point out that it is this uncertainty and lack of guarantees that have left the industry in the dark for so long. With these certainties now addressed with this bill and the amendments which Labour are tabling today, the industry can now have the confidence to plan and move forward. My hope is that the signal that we will send today by passing this bill on a cross-party basis, that there is a clear consensus on the vital role that nuclear will continue to have in our energy mix. This message is fundamental as we hopefully move on from Sizewell C to other projects, and planning these as a fleet to both drive down costs and maintain and indeed expand the world-class expertise and skills of the British nuclear sector.
Bob Seeley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to speak to Amendments 1 and 2. If I've got time, I'll get in Amendment 9, but I'll speak for no more than 5 minutes. But just by way of an overall approach, I mean, I hear what people say about the importance of renewables, but it's not renewables or nuclear. Frankly, if the world is going to have any chance of meeting its carbon targets, it's not either or, it's and. And I'm afraid to say, when you see the environmental, energy and security disaster that is Germany's imbecilic energy policy caused by the shutting of nuclear, the dependence on Russian gas and lignite coal, the dirtiest form of energy production known to humanity, gladly.
I'm not speaking on behalf of Germany, because Germany is, of course, in a very different position to Britain. It is more or less landlocked. It doesn't have sea. It doesn't have wind in the same way. Britain has got a massive opportunity to invest in new renewable energy that no other country has, apart from, for example, Greece, and they're doing that.
And I think my German relatives would confirm that they have wind in Germany. And the Baltic Sea. Thank you very much indeed. Including reports from the UN and others, there is no reputable case that disagrees that if we are to meet zero carbon at some point in a realistic, next 20, 30, 40 years, whether we like it or not, nuclear is going to play an increasingly significant element of that. It is a very low form of carbon energy, no greenhouse gas. I will make some progress and then I will give way again. And I think it is important to take that on board. When it comes to foreign ownership and foreign funding, would I start from here? No. I'm uncomfortable about the idea that we would ever want to build an untried, untested Chinese nuclear reactor in this country, especially one that has not been built anywhere else, to say nothing of the geopolitical ramifications of that. I'm not hugely happy that we have Chinese funding in place at the moment. But I understand that actually the purpose at the moment and the critical point is that we need a sense of momentum to make progress on this issue. So in a perfect world, we would not be starting from here. I'll give way now if you'd like to come in.
I thank him for giving way. He was talking earlier there about the importance of nuclear to get to net zero, but the UK government's actually committed to decarbonisation in the electricity grid by 2035. So there's no way on earth, if we're going to rely on nuclear, that can actually fully decarbonise the grid. It's other things that are needed. It's carbon capture and storage, it's green hydrogen.
Again, he's making a perfectly sensible point, but I think his argument's frankly a bit of a cop-out, that we can do it all with renewables. We're not. I want